So we're going to talk about some quote-unquote new pests. We'll get through as many as we can. I like bugs. All right, so basically what we're starting with today are the bark and ambrosia beetles. Have you heard of these before? Some of you, yes. So these are wood-boring beetles. On the screen they look Godzilla-sized, but how big are these really? Yeah, so these guys are like, none of these are larger than 3 millimeters in length, right? So here you see them up close and beautiful. Again, remember, I like bugs. But really they're 3 millimeters in size. So are you going to be able to see all this ornamentation and things like that? Maybe you'll see a black speck that moves. And probably not, because where in the plants do you find these bark and ambrosia beetles? Well, they bore inside, right? So you don't really see them because they're inside of the trees and shrubs, so we'll talk about what they do, but just wanted to show you what some of these are the tropical species. So we have ones that look similar to this, maybe not as ornate, but any idea how many species of these bark and ambrosia beetles there are? Throw out a number. 2,000. Who's going higher or lower? Oh, it's like Price is Right. Higher, definitely higher. It's like 7,000, estimated to be about 7,000 of these bark and ambrosia beetles. So many, many, many of them. Not easy to tell apart or identify two species because species ID depends on like microscopic little hairs and spines to try and separate the species, so it's not easy to do. The thing is, they're kind of ecological catastrophes in the making, these little beetles. We used to not really pay much attention to them because they fed on what kinds of trees? Does anybody know? Yeah, dead or dying trees, right? So that doesn't really bug us. They're just recycling the dead and dying trees. However, more so they've become problems because they can attack healthy or apparently healthy and living trees. Anybody know why that is? Or who's to blame? Is it the beetles' fault? No, good answer. Why is it not the beetles' fault? Well, here's something about predators. Okay, it's our fault, meaning people. Why is that? What did we do? Change the environment. Yeah, so basically we moved them all over the world, from their native habitats into all kinds of new places for them. They get to new places, and all of a sudden they're able to attack healthy and live trees. We don't know exactly why that is. In their native habitats, they still feed on dead and dying trees. Once we move them around, and how do we usually move them around? I know you're purposely not like putting them in your wallet and moving them through customs, but how do they usually get through? Yeah, either in pallets or other shipping materials or just plant material that's being shipped around the world. So usually these are accidental introductions. So we're moving them at massive rates now, huge interceptions. So at the ports, we have aphis inspectors that inspect plant material. Anybody know about how much of that plant material actually gets inspected before it's allowed to come into the country? You're saying 25 what percent? Higher or lower? Lower. Way lower. Yeah, it's 2%. It's like 2% of all the plant material that comes into the country gets inspected, looking for both insect and disease problems. So are things getting in? Yes, lots of things are getting in. And then when they make these interceptions at the ports, what percentage do you think end up being these types of beetles? 0.2, higher or lower? Don't go lower. 58% of all the insects intercepted at the ports in plant material end up being these bark and ambrosia beetles. Right? Because they're hard to detect, because they're in plants, they're in material. Sometimes all you see is a little millimeter hole on the outside of something, indicating that they're in there. So, and those are just the ones we find, right? So there's many getting in all the time. Numbers have increased exponentially over the past couple of decades. Back in 2010, this was a survey that was done by Dr. Lasham, the ornamental specialist in entomology here. So these are just different species of these bark and ambrosia beetles that were caught in traps. The one we're going to concentrate on, the first one, and I'm not even going to bother with the Latin name, that's the granulate ambrosia beetle. It used to be called the Asian ambrosia beetle. Look how many were caught just in their traps. And it is among the top 2 or 3 most destructive bark beetles to nurseries, basically, to producers of all different kinds of trees and shrubs. So basically, we're moving them around like crazy. They get here, they don't have natural enemies. The other reason that they kind of start attacking healthy trees, we think, is because the beetles are confused. How do trees, well, that's a good question. How do beetles identify like a dead or dying tree versus a healthy living tree? There's no sign. What do you think it is? Somebody says sap. Opportunistic what? Infections. But so a beetle's flying around. How does it know to like land on this tree that's dead as opposed to this tree that's alive? Smells, yes. You're right. The trees give off chemicals, so different chemical compounds. As trees become stressed, they give off different combinations of these chemical compounds. So one of the things that the beetles really like is ethanol. They're alcoholics. Trees, when they're stressed, give off more ethanol than healthy trees. And the species of beetle we're going to talk about is really good at being efficient and capable at finding these trees that give off this ethanol. The problem is when you take these species of beetles and move them to new locations, now what they're meeting are trees that they've never met before, right? So these beetles now have this whole huge host range of new species they've never encountered before. So they get confused because these trees now are giving off different combinations of chemicals, so the beetles are confused, the trees are confused. How do trees defend themselves against insect pests? They don't run. What do? Now's the time for sap. Sap, right? So sap is one of the natural defenses of trees. They give off sap, it glues up the beetles. The other thing is bark. Bark and wood of trees has lots of toxic compounds in it that prevents insects from feeding on it. So bark is kind of toxic to insects. But the thing is, the trees, they've never seen this beetle before. They get all confused. They don't know what to do. Sometimes there's a hypersensitive response. Do you know what that means? So basically, yeah, so like allergies, hypersensitive response to an outside stimulus. So basically the trees, what they try to do is compartmentalize. Do you know what that is? They basically kill off cells to prevent the pathogen or the pest from getting farther into them. So they go into this hypersensitive response and they end up kind of leading to their own death because they've never been introduced to these particular species. So we don't exactly know. So basically it's the beetle, it's the fungus they carry, all of this leads to plant death eventually. Do you want to see pictures? Look, giant beetle that's really only like 2.5 millimeters in size. So this is the species we're talking about. This is granulate ambrosia beetle, very common. Okay, new was in quotes. Anybody know when this beetle was first found in the US? Notice I like to ask questions. I will not apologize. It's your quiz at the end of the day. Pick a decade, any decade. 70s, yeah. 1974, it was first identified in South Carolina in peach trees. So that's where we first found it. Since then, this beetle has spread kind of all up and down the East Coast and farther out west into Canada, into Europe, so it's all over. It's native to Southeast Asia, but now we've brought it all over the place. The thing is, these beetles are really good at feeding on different plants. Look at the host range. This is just kind of a reported host range at more than 120 different species. So these are all kinds of plants within all kinds of families. These beetles are just really good at finding a host. They don't even have to be all in the same plant family. The problem is they get into fruit trees, nut trees, shade trees, ornamentals, pretty much most plants. Not really into conifers, but almost any other, a lot of times smooth bark plant they can get into. Has anybody had these in their yard? One person. Lucky you. Keep them there. So we'll talk about what they do. Well, we'll talk about a little bit about their identification. Remember, they're really small, so these are things you're not going to see. But when we get samples into the lab, these are things that I need to look at in order to try and identify the species. So characteristics include the shape of the antennae. This giant thing over here is this little microscopic antenna of the beetle, the shape of that. This is the back of the beetle. Some beetles have like teeth on the back or indentations. Do you know what the spot identifying characteristic is here? They're called granulate ambrosia beetle because they have granules on that declavity at the end of the elytra? That's too many words, right? They don't have a shiny hiney. It's dull. This is an ID characteristic because other similar species have a very shiny declavity back there. The other thing is the spines on the tibia. So there's all these kind of microscopic features just to try to identify these to species. Have you guys ever tried identifying insects to species? Have you ever used like identification keys or other things like that? Are they easy?
No.
No. They're a lot of times they're vague, right? They'll be like, the beetle is grayish to yellowish. Okay, right, so they're not easy to use. Keys are only as good as, well, as your knowledge, but also keys are only as good as what collectively entomologists know. So if all of a sudden we get a new beetle in from Asia or something and it's not in any of the keys, how to identify this new thing? We send it to the Smithsonian or someplace else and I get rid of it because I can't do it. I took a class in bark beetle identification. You know what I learned at the end of it? Still not easy to do. It was fascinating, but still not easy to do. So these are spot identifying features, but basically to you, they're going to look like these little 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter long beetles. So this is what the species looks like. Sexual dimorphism. Do you know what dimorphism is? Di means the two sexes look different. Okay, which one's the female and which one's the male? Who's saying the female is on your left? Most of the room. Yes, the male is the tiny, scrawny one. And this is true. See, there we go. Tiny, scrawny male. And this is true for most bark and ambrosia beetles, and a lot of insects, actually. The female lays eggs. They're usually larger, but in the case of bark beetles, this is fairly common. Usually what happens is the males never even leave the galleries. I'll show you what they do. They bore into the trees, but the males are born in there, never leave there. They mate with their siblings, and then they die. Some species have taken it so far as the male, basically the male of this one particular family of beetles, it ends up, as an adult, it has mandibles. You know what mandibles are? Those are the big chewing mouth parts. Copulatory organs, and then the rest of it looks like a grub its whole life. It basically has a mouth, reproductive organs, and is a grub. So there you go. The other thing that's, is it the way it should be? No? Okay. Sorry. Sorry, not sorry. The other thing that makes these beetles so successful, one, they don't feed on the plants, right? I told you the plants themselves are toxic. They are fungus farmers, so we'll get more into that. They feed on fungus that they bring in there with them. They're very small, so they go undetected. The other reason they're so successful is that they have all kinds of different mating strategies and reproductive strategies. In a lot of cases, the females don't need a male to reproduce. Oh, there's clapping. I knew this was the right crowd for this. I knew his ex-wife joke was gonna fall flat. So they have this bizarro reproduction, right? So the females don't necessarily need males to mate, or the unfertilized eggs become the males, the fertilized eggs will become the females. Basically, you only need one. Potentially, you need one mated female to come into the country to start a new infestation, potentially, right? So you can see the subtitle of my talk is, "This is hopeless." It's a doom and gloom talk. So it's not easy. They're not easy to control. All right, more strange words. Univoltine holometabolic life cycle. Anybody? Uni means one. So univoltine means one generation per year. Does everybody know what a generation for insects means? It means the time it goes, right, it goes from egg back to that egg stage again. So that happens once. Think of aphids. How many generations a year? Lots of them, right? They just keep reproducing the whole growing season. They say it's univoltine in New Jersey. What happens as you go farther south to generation numbers? Usually there are more generation numbers, right? It's warmer there. They have a longer time. They develop more quickly when it's warmer. And then holometabolic. Another test question. Did you guys learn about metamorphosis ever? Yeah. Right? Insects have to molt in order to grow. So holometabolic, this is when you have the larva, the pupa, and the adult stage. So you also call it complete metamorphosis when you have the pupal stage. So this is true for all beetles. So this is what they look like. Over on the right, those are millimeter markings, right? So you can see the beetle is like about 2 millimeters in length. The pupae look very similar, but they're light colored. These are in the tree, and then these are the larvae that hatch from the eggs. In case you don't do millimeters, these beetles are about the size of FDR's ear. So you get a dye mount and you look at the ear, and that's the size of the beetle. Small. All right, so what do? They're called ambrosia beetles. This kind of giant group of beetles are the ones that bore into the heartwood, right? So these are not the ones that stay in the cambium, which is the outer living layer just under the bark. These are the ones that actually go into the wood. And what happens is these guys overwinter as mated females, right? So over the winter, mated females are just kind of hanging out in the tree. In the spring, sort of early May, they start emerging. Those females come out, and they start looking for new hosts to invade. Because they're mated already, they mated in the season prior, they can just start laying eggs. The other thing that they can control is basically the sex ratio of their offspring. It's kind of like this room. Yes, because the sex ratio is 10-to-1, females to males for these guys. So literally, they only produce males for one purpose, and only a couple of them. Nobody's clapping. All right, so back to ambrosia beetles. So they bore into the wood. We called them fungus farmers. What happens is they carry a fungus with them, and that fungus is their food source. So these guys bore through the wood, the females bore through the wood, and the reason they're boring through the wood is to set up their brood chambers. So the brood chambers are where they're gonna lay their eggs, where those eggs are gonna hatch into larvae, right? So they don't actually feed on the tree. What they do is when they first make those tunnels or chambers, they deposit the fungus into there. And the fungus grows, and that's what the larvae will feed on. So they really are mushroom farmers. But these are the ones that go into the wood. So here you can see up close the eggs starting to hatch into the little larvae. They're grubs, right? The beetle larvae are called grubs. So those grubs start to hatch, and then they start to feed on the fungus. I think there's a better picture coming up of the fungus. All right, so have you heard of blue stain before? Have you ever cut into a tree and it looked kind of dark or blue in there? Nobody? A couple people. So blue stain, ambrosia, this refers to the fungus that the beetle is carrying into the tree, and that's its food source. So this is another reason they're successful. They feed on fungus. They don't have to worry about all the toxins that are in the plant. So that's why they can kind of go into almost any host, because the toxins don't even matter to them. So this fungus is carried by the beetles. It's called a mycangium. A mycangium is just a pocket. So some beetles carry these fungal spores. You guys talked about spores, right? You've done diseases today. So these spores, they have to carry it on their body somehow. Some carry it in their armpits. Some carry it in their cheeks. This particular species of beetle, it's hard to see in this picture, but they have like a pocket. So this is the thorax. These are the wings. So there's this pocket under here that they put the spores in. And then when the females get into a suitable host, they somehow, and we don't know how, they release those spores into those tunnels, and the fungus will then grow. And then this is up close what the fungus looks like. You see this white, this is mycelium and spores. That's all growing. So once the female has a nice crop of that, that's the only time she's going to then lay eggs. She will not lay her eggs if the fungus doesn't survive in the tree, because then there's no food source. So once there's a nice crop of fungus, she lays her eggs, those eggs hatch into larvae, and then that's what they feed on. All right, so the other thing is, when they carry this fungus in, they potentially carry in secondary pests. Like they accidentally introduce other fungi into there, right? So once you drill a hole into the tree, it becomes an infection court. Have you heard that before, the term infection court? Like a place for other secondary fungi to get into. So sometimes they carry fusarium with them as well, not purposely because that's not their food, but other pathogens get in. You've heard of fusarium? Yes? It's a fungus that is pathogenic to lots of different plants in lots of different ways, and then a couple of other fungi. So once the larvae are done going through their instars, meaning they molt, they then molt into the pupal stage. In that pupal stage, they don't feed, but this is what they look like. What do you notice about the color of the chamber? Is it white anymore? No, it's black. So now they've exhausted the fungus source. It's still alive, but it's no longer growing the spores and spores and mycelium that the beetles feed on. But it hasn't died out completely. These beetles will then emerge as the adults. While they're inside of the tree, have you ever seen this before, these little toothpicks? Pictures of this before, maybe? So what happens is, as the females are making their brood chambers, right? See these little toothpicks hanging out from the tree? So this is as she's excavating the tunnels, she's pushing out sawdust. So this is a combination of sawdust and sap. So as the tunnels get longer, these little toothpicks grow. They can be 3 to 4 centimeters in size. You don't notice them on windy or rainy days because they break off. But on clear days, they can be sticking out all over the plant. It looks very spiny. There's some cool pictures of it. They are not frass. What's frass? Poop, exactly. Why are they, how do we know they're not frass? Because the beetles don't feed on the wood, right? So she chews them up to make the tunnel, but they feed on the fungus. So it's not actually frass that's coming out, if that makes you feel better about it. It's not like little poop sticks. We used to think it was frass. It's not frass. All right, so now I'm just going to show you many pictures of this in many different plants. Pawpaw, do you guys know what pawpaw is? Love pawpaw. It's a native fruit, and this is Japanese snowbell here. Oh, that's just cool. Yes? No? Nobody agrees? So this was actually from the gardens. A couple of years ago, this was a sample growing in the gardens, and they asked us to come out and look. And this is why we came out and looked, because they noticed these wilting branches. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but the branches are wilting, right? So that's what they noticed, come out, you know, what's going on. And as soon as we get out there, we're like, look down. Oops, sorry. So this is the crown of the same plant. This plant, close up, just loaded with these borers. So every toothpick represents an entrance hole for a beetle. What do you do about this? What's the control for this tree? Yeah, unfortunately, there is no rescue treatment. I told you it was doom and gloom talk. There's no rescue treatment once they're in there. The only thing to do in this case is cut down the tree. Now, they don't necessarily always kill a tree. However, the smaller the caliper, right, the smaller the diameter of the tree, probably it's going to succumb. Right, so again, this is the symptoms you would see up top. What's the problem with trying to diagnose something just from this symptom? Can you do it? No, right? You saw all kinds of symptoms in the other talks. Wilting could be almost anything. Could be anything with a vascular problem in the stem, could be a root problem, could be too much water, could be not enough water, right? It's hard to see here, but this is that same branch, and at the bottom you can see little toothpicks coming out. This is a large Zelkova, and you see the toothpicks? Do you think this tree is going to die? Probably not. I mean, this is a large established Zelkova, probably not going to die from this. There might be some branch dieback, so the trees do have defenses, but again, the smaller they are, the more stressed they are, they're probably going to succumb. And again, we don't know exactly what the method is, why they die. Is it the tunneling? Does the tunneling kill the plant? I hear some tentative no's. Be confident, say no. No, why not? Because they're not in the cambium, right? The cambium is the living tissue under the bark. They're not in there. They're in the dead heartwood, so it's not the girdling that kills a tree. It's a combination of the stress that the trees are already going under. That's how the beetles first found them, and also these fungal associations that they have. So sometimes you get water-soaked spots around the entry holes. It's hard to see in rough bark trees. So her question is, are these beetles the only ones that make these toothpicks or straws? They are not. There's a couple of other basically very similar beetles that do the same thing that also make the toothpicks. But not every ambrosia beetle makes the toothpicks. It's kind of diagnostic of a few common ones. And then sometimes, like I said, the toothpicks are on the ground, it rained, it was windy, so you'll find them accumulated underneath the plant. What the heck is this bizarre thing? This is the Mary Poppins trap. All right, so this is a lingering funnel beetle trap. The umbrella is there just so that your trap doesn't get full of rain, should it rain, and then your beetles all wash out. So basically what this is a series of funnels, and you see the stems hanging off? Those are just stems of susceptible plants. What happens when you prune a tree? It cries a little bit, but what else does it do? It gives off those same volatile compounds, right? You cause the stress, it starts giving off these compounds, it gives off ethanol. So basically, these guys are so good at finding the ethanol, you just have to hang a few branches of these stress trees, and that acts as a lure, right? So they're attracted to this trap, they fall into the funnels, and then they fall into this collection basin down below, and you can pick through that at your whim. It's not easy because these are not the only things you will catch. You will catch many species of bark beetles, all kinds of other things. We get traps from the State Department of Ag that we have to sift through. Usually those traps have been sitting in somebody's car for a couple days. Do you know what dead insects in a plastic bag smell like? I do. It's not good. So these are just some examples of ways to trap them. What's the purpose of trying to trap them? To get an ID, but also it serves as timing for control, right? Because what you need to do is you need to figure out when these beetles are first flying in the spring so that you can then protect the trees. Because I told you, once they're in the tree, there's no rescue treatment. There is no systemic insecticide that will work once they've bored into the trees. So these are fun homework things you can do in the spring. This is, yes, a soda bottle. And basically, you can just put ethanol in there or an ethanol lure. You can even use unscented hand sanitizer that's ethanol-based. That works just as well. They'll be attracted to it. They'll fall into it. You can collect them from there. Same thing here. This just has, a lot of times what they get collected in is low toxicity antifreeze that kind of preserves them. So and it doesn't dry out, so that's what they get collected in. Do you know what this thing is, the yellow thing? No, it's that like tornado thing. Do you know what I'm talking about? For kids, they sell it. You put the two soda bottles together and you make a tornado. It's a very scientific insect trap. So this is, again, the funnel traps. You can adjust them to the proper size. All right, these beetles fly at night, kind of dusk and toward the evening, and it's also interesting where they fly. Usually with an insect trap, you think how high would you put it? Would you put it on the ground or in the air if they're flying? Probably in the air, you would think. Well, they've done research on what the best height is for hanging these traps, and it's only like 0.5 meter to 1.5 meters. If you hang it higher or much lower than that, you're going to miss out on many beetles. So they are targeted to this particular height. That's where they prefer the main trunks of the trees. So this is the other thing you can do. This is a hollowed out log. You can put ethanol in there. You can just soak that log in ethanol for 24 hours and then hang it up, and that serves as a lure. They inject trees with ethanol to serve as a trap. The other thing you can do, so now this is where we have to talk about the stress. So we talked about these guys affecting apparently healthy plants, right? However, these plants that they are attacking, we have figured out, are under stress. So usually when you think of environmental stress, what's the one you normally go to? Drought stress, right? You usually think drought stress, that serves as a precursor to a lot of different problems for plants. What if I tell you the opposite is true for this? These guys preferentially go to plants that are flooded, that have been flooded, have been too wet, poor drainage. The other stressors are low temperature damage and frost damage. But really, if you have a drought stress tree next to one that was overwatered in a pot, the beetles will preferentially go to the overwatered pot. What does an overwatered plant look like sometimes? Okay, you're saying it's softer, but can you, walking through your landscape, can you tell it's softer? Can you tell a tree that's maybe had a bit too much water? Not all the time, right? What happens when we have a lot of spring rains? What do the plants look like? Beautiful, right? They're growing. They're actively growing. They're green. There's a lot of water in the system. That's what I mean by these plants are apparently healthy. They look healthy to you. They're not dwarfed. They're not nothing, but they have been flooded. The beetles know that. The plants are giving off ethanol, and that's the trees that they go to. So it's kind of really another reason why it's hard to control them. It's hard to tell what an apparently healthy yet under stress tree is. What's your guess for why they don't go to the drought stress trees? You're saying too hard to get into. It's a good guess. Yeah, that's what we think it is. The fungus won't grow well in a drought-stressed tree, right? Fungi like a certain amount of moisture. So this is why we think the beetles preferentially go to the trees that have suitable or too much water in the system, because they need the fungus to grow.
What does fungus live on?
Her question is, what does the fungus live on? So the fungus lives on the plant. It's growing on the, it's growing in the plant, growing on the plant cells. So it's a symbiont with the beetle, but it needs that plant host in order to grow. So this last example is, this is basically a dogwood put in a garbage bag and watered. So it's another, you can make your own just trap tree by overwatering a plant that is not tolerant of wet feet, and dogwoods don't like wet feet. So if the dry tree and the wet tree, or the flooded tree, are both giving off ethanol, how does the beetle know which tree to go to? It's a good question. The other thing is that ethanol is not the only component that the trees are giving off. There are other chemicals, so there are probably other combinations that tell the beetle. And the beetles are just awesome. I'm sorry, they're really good at what they do. They know. Because, like I said, there are other compounds given off. Ethanol just happens to be one that we know about that they really like, but it's not the only thing that the trees are giving off. All right, so the other thing you can do is, so this was actually the styrax from the gardens that we got a log brought into the lab because we wanted to take pictures, because we're those crazy people. So it was hanging out in the lab for a bit, and beetles were emerging from it. You can see the toothpicks. Here's a beetle. The other thing is, what happens in like nursery type situations is, if you don't necessarily want to kill every infested tree immediately, because you can leave some of them as trap trees, meaning the ones that if you see an infested tree, it's obviously a tree that the beetle likes. If you leave it there for no longer than 30 days, though, just 2 to 3 weeks really, what you do is you attract most of the beetles from the environment to those trap trees, and then before they have a chance to emerge again, that's when you cut the tree down, right? So that's why you would leave it. As soon as you see infection or infestation, you leave it there. It serves to like kind of draw all the other females out from the environment to that tree, because for some reason she likes that tree, or they like that tree. But what you need to be careful. You don't want to leave it there for longer, because all you've done is made a bigger problem, and then they will emerge. Her question is, do you then burn the tree? So the recommendations are to either burn or chip the tree. You can bury. You give it to your neighbor as a decorative piece of totem pole. I don't know. But yeah, the nursery recommendations are to either burn or chip or bury, but you don't want to just. The question is, when do you see those toothpicks come out of the tree? So the beetles first emerge in kind of early May. I took out that slide of their emergence. They start to emerge then, and then they start boring into the tree. So soon after that, so in the spring, is when you would see those toothpicks being formed. They come out of their overwintering locations and infest new plants. So that's when you start looking for them. Okay, so really the key management here is what? Yeah, it really is. It really is trying to maintain a healthy plant, maintain plant vigor. This is all about IPM, so that's always like our first control, is maintain plant vigor. It's very important with this, but it's not always easy to do, especially, like I said, in the spring. I also talked about low temperature injury, frost damage. So those are also precursors for these beetles. So a lot of times there's not much you could do to avoid those things. Yes. So that's a good point. Her point is that when she saw them all on plants that were kind of marginal to our area, meaning plants that maybe were pushing the boundaries of where they like it, right? So that's definitely a reason that the plants would be stressed. So you do the best you can. So what types of things can you do? Well, the first is plant trees in the appropriate location. Don't stick a dogwood in the low spot of your yard just because you want to have a dogwood there, but it's the low spot of your yard, right? Don't over mulch. So really, it's picking the proper plant that's best suited to the site that you have, so that it's not overly stressed. Okay, and then what do you do? So basically, when you see them start collecting in the traps, if you're a commercial nursery, that's when you apply your controls. So basically what they figured out is bifenthrin and cypermethrin, these are the two chemical compounds that work the best. Do they 100% control infestations? No. They don't. They work pretty well, but nothing is 100%. So remember, these are insecticides that have to be on the bark before the beetles get in. right? So once they get in, it's hopeless. So the question is, do we see bigger infestations after Sandy and other storms and flooding? I'm sure. We don't always get samples, especially samples that are easy to diagnose in the field, don't necessarily come to us. So I'm sure there were more. That's another good point, is we keep having, there's predictions for more and more extreme weather events. As this happens, this opens up opportunities for these other species, the 7,000 bark beetles that are moving to be able to exploit plants that are now all of a sudden going through these extreme environmental conditions. Okay, walnut twig beetle, okay, basically very similar. Looks very similar. I mean, there are microscopic differences, but I'm talking to you about this one because this is one that is more recent of an infestation. But look at it, I mean, it looks very similar. However, it's like half the size of the one I just showed you. Really small. The microscopic identification one of the things are these tubercles on the prothorax. Again, you need a microscope, not easy to see. Okay, so where did this walnut twig beetle come from? This is interesting. This is a native beetle. The beetle is native to the Southwest. In the Southwest, it feeds on Arizona walnut. It will feed on other plants, but it prefers Arizona walnut where it came from in the Southwest. It carries a fungus with it. It causes a disease called thousand canker disease. Have you heard of that? Yep. Right, so thousand canker disease. What's interesting, we'll talk about the fungus is also native. So we don't know what the heck happened. You have a native beetle, a native fungus that wasn't pathogenic. All of a sudden the two together are pathogenic and killing walnut trees. So somehow there was this host and geographical switch. We just don't know what exactly happened. All right, so what happened, the way this infestation kind of got moved around the country is, what is walnut used for, the wood? Furniture, right? It's a good furniture wood. So what happened is boards that were infested with the beetle and the fungus were sold online. Places like Craigslist were shipped all over the place throughout the country to Tennessee. And kind of the disease and the beetle moved that way. All right, so this is the native range of black walnuts. Large area, because this beetle and the fungus will also infect and infest this species. It has also been found to get into butternut, more so in like the Oregon area, but we have butternuts. These logs are about a little over a foot each. This vial, it's hard to see, but this vial contains 23,000 beetles. The vial's like this big. I told you they're small. You're not going to notice them. What do you notice about the bark of walnuts? Is it smooth? No. Are you going to see tiny little 0.5 millimeter holes? Probably not. I'm sorry, gloom and doom. Okay, occasionally on smooth bark you might see kind of bleeding from all these holes. So again, these are the entrance holes for these beetles. Here it is again. A lot of times you find them on the other underneath sides of the twigs. But okay, so here's the penny, right? You see all the little holes? You're going to notice that? No. Does black walnut get all kinds of other problems? Yes. So just because you see a dying black walnut doesn't mean that it's this beetle. So this is what they do. In this case, this is a bark beetle, so it lives in the cambium. So it makes these galleries right in the living tissue. This is a trap survey. So remember I said it was native to the Southwest. These red are areas where the walnut twig beetle was found in traps. Where are we? Like right here. This is very close. It's close. We may have it. We may not have picked it up yet in traps, but it's around. So we're getting traps. Actually, we just got an email yesterday from the New Jersey State Forestry Department. I said that title all wrong, but from the New Jersey Foresters, where she's been trapping for several weeks, and I'll be getting those traps to look for these beetles. This is what the fungus looks like, basically. So here's the beetle next to a penny, tiny beetle. This is the fungus growing on a plate. So basically it's the same thing. The beetle carries the fungus in. The fungus causes the disease called thousand cankers. We're skipping through maps because I want to show you. These white beetles are covered in fungal spores. So when they move to a different area, they carry those spores into that walnut tree. And this is why it's called thousand cankers disease. So this is a walnut branch with the bark kind of just peeled off. Every place that a beetle goes in, it carries the fungus, and the fungus produces a little canker. So these cankers are only like 1 inch or 2 in size, so they're tiny little cankers, but you get such a massive infestation that these cankers build up and they girdle the stem because you have so many beetles going in, and that's what gives you the dieback. So that's why it's called thousand canker disease. Thousands of beetles, thousands of cankers, you get a dead tree. So here's this same tree a year later. Does that mean the beetles were only in there for a year? No, not necessarily. It just means that from the time you first see symptoms of an infestation, the tree quickly succumbs. However, the beetles could have been in there for a while and you just didn't notice. There were no symptoms, very small exit holes. Look how high up it is in the tree. So it's not that they were just there for a year, it's just the symptom progression goes very quickly once it starts. More dead pictures. Okay, what do you do about this? If you suspect this or find this, you need to contact someone. County agent, us, State Department of Ag. We're still looking for this. Like I said, it's close. It's in Pennsylvania. Okay, last one. Dr. Hamilton talked about this, I think. Spotted lanternfly, a thing of beauty. Yeah. It's a beautiful insect, right? All right, so it's native to China, India, Vietnam. It was introduced into Japan, Korea, also into the US. The first time it was found was September of 2014. So this really is a new one. Less than 3 years ago, we first found it in Pennsylvania. It gets into 70 different trees. The big problem here is that it likes grapes, it likes apples, it likes fruit trees. It's got a huge host range, could potentially infest all those plants. It preferentially likes tree of heaven. Do you know what that is? Ailanthus, tree of heaven, a very weedy tree. So the problem is not that, who cares if it kills all the tree of heaven, which it won't end up killing them all. But the problem is before it gets to tree of heaven, it feeds on all these other plants. All right, so this is where a detection survey, everything red is where it's been found since 2014 in Pennsylvania. Do any of you guys go to this area? Don't bring anything back. Your family has to stay down there, that's it, you can't see them anymore. So this is what it looks like up close. They hold their wings tent-like over the body, black spots on kind of grayish wings. You have these dark rectangles at the end of the wings. Going back, you saw that the hind wings, kind of when they get startled, they like open their wings and they shine the red part of the wing. They're really poor flyers, but they're very good hoppers. Usually we don't talk about plant hoppers at all because they're not plant pests generally, not devastating plant pests. Okay, so this is a large insect. Over 3/4 of an inch in size. That's what I call big for an insect. We get phone calls all the time in the lab, and every bug that people try to describe is either really big or really small. And that's as far as I get with size on the phone. That's why it doesn't work, so good luck with the helpline. All right, what happens is these females lay eggs on almost anything. They like tree of heaven, but they'll lay it on any vertical surface, stones, other trees. And they lay eggs starting September through early December. So in the fall is when the eggs are being laid. The eggs have this waxy coating as they dry. They start out this pale gray color, and then they turn into what looks like mud. The egg cases, there's about 30 to 50 eggs per case. Can you see the egg cases here? Here's one, right? Bark colored, right? Not so easy to see. What does it remind you of a little bit? Gypsy moth egg cases are covered in like brown hairs. These are covered in a wax that eventually turns brownish. So they overwinter in these egg cases, 30 to 50 eggs per case. They hatch in the spring, and then they hatch into these little guys. Oh, cute, right? The babies are cute. All right, so the nymphs, do they look like the adults? No, in terms of color, they do not. So they start off this black with white spots. Eventually, as they go through their instars, as they molt, they get more and more red on them. Every stage feeds. They have piercing, sucking mouth parts, right? This is the piercing, sucking mouth part. It's a true bug. And then can you see all the bleeding on the bark? So can you see the insects now that I'm pointing at them? These all here. So those are the insects. As they feed with their really long mouth parts, you will see bleeding as they go to the tree of heaven and other plants. This is tree of heaven, in case you needed a refresher. All right, what is this? So what they're doing in Pennsylvania is one of the ways of control is, I didn't talk about it when you saw the egg cases, but citizens are doing volunteer egg scraping. So mechanical control of just the egg cases, scraping them off with like any kind of tool, credit card, anything like that, and throwing them away or putting them in alcohol, gets rid of a lot of them. The other thing they're doing is banding trees. So this is like a sticky trap, right? Sticky side out. Because once the eggs hatch, the nymphs go up and down the plants to feed. So as they feed, they get stuck on this, the sticky trap. So these are all the nymphs. Again, as they get older, that's when they start to move to tree of heaven. Have you seen cicadas like this? When cicadas emerge and they're like basically someone spilled cereal on the ground? although this is not appetizing cereal. The other thing they're doing is that they're using insecticides. They leave trap trees. So they're doing host eradication. So they'll cut down, off a property, they'll cut down or get rid of the tree of heaven. But what they'll do is they'll leave a couple tree of heaven, preferably the males, because tree of heaven comes in male and female. You leave the males up, they don't produce seeds to repopulate. And then what happens is these serve as trap trees, so all the spotted lanternflies in the area will then, because they like tree of heaven to lay their eggs on, that's where they'll go toward the end of summer. And then once they're on this tree, what they've been doing is they've been using a systemic insecticide. Dinotefuran is a systemic insecticide that they've been using on this tree. So you cull the tree of heaven on your property, you do egg scrapings if you see them, and then once they're on the trap tree, they're controlling them with insecticides. This is just showing you within 1 year, less than half a year, the area has expanded that's under quarantine. Like there are new townships being added. First it was just Berks County, now it's more counties. I just want to show you what a quarantine means. Quarantine means you're not supposed to move any of this stuff from the areas that have been quarantined. And the stuff, by stuff I mean, okay, you obviously can't move the insects. Like if you see the insects, you can't move the insects. You're not supposed to remove brush, debris, landscaping waste, logs, firewood, nursery stock, crated materials. Look at the stuff on the bottom. They will also lay their eggs, just like gypsy moths, on like campers, patio furniture, grills, that kind of stuff. So if you're in the quarantine area, you're not supposed to move that stuff. The way you can move that stuff is you enter into a compliance agreement. There's a checklist that you go through, make sure that you didn't find egg cases on any of this stuff. You sign the form, you carry it in your car with you. Commercial growers have to go through different compliance before they're allowed to move this material. I just want to show you, since the beginning, they've estimated that 1.5 million of these have been killed by people going out and just scraping egg masses. Because when you do that, they want you to report it on the website. So 1.5 million from egg case scraping, and then 0.6 or 631,000 have been controlled by just tree banding. So the thing is, it's close. It's been here, we think, for a couple of years before they found it in 2014, potentially devastating to fruits and grapes and things like that. If you see it, tell someone. If you don't have it yet, they'll bring it back. Okay, so basically part of the quarantine, if you look through it, is that mulch is supposed to be properly, if you're moving it out of the area, what you should do, well, one of the things you do with the trees you take down in these areas is you chip them, and then you can use them in mulch in that area. However, mulch that's being moved is supposed to be properly composted, and they explain how to do that. So really, leaf mulch, I think, is not in the quarantine, but other products are. Well, Pennsylvania Department of Ag is who's doing it now because the insect pest is in Pennsylvania, and they've got a giant volunteer program, going out into communities. I even saw just this morning, I was reading about it, they have like a contest for students to make posters illustrating the quarantine and what not to do. So if you want to know more about this, go on just Google spotted lanternfly, you'll get onto the Pennsylvania Department of Ag website. There's a lot of information, pictures, it's a very good website.